You guys started this song. You did that for me, and here I had ready to go a song that I was going to sing. And if had I attended your meeting, I would have brought in, like you used to have those little books. Okay, I have enough ego, so I got to do this.
Go for it.
God save great Washington, Virginia's warlike son, and make him brave. Defend him from the blows of Howe and all his foes. Guard him where he goes. Washington save.
All right.
Now that might be how Justin Bieber got started, but what can I tell you? This is an unusual talk. This is George Washington. I started this talk about 7 years ago. I dislike anybody who starts with an admonition, but I have to do it. I started this talk about 7 or 8 years ago, and it was presented. People would listen. Isn't that nice? You know, they get something out of it. Something happened 4 years ago, and suddenly the same words, the same presenting, suddenly became volatile, and people were reading into what I'm saying. Okay, point blank, this talk ends at 1792. Don't read anything forward. Don't read anything into it. This is what I said before, and it's where I'm standing now. And unfortunately, that's become, even for the Civil War Roundtable, I have to admonish people. Let's not talk about statues being torn down. We're talking about the Battle of Gettysburg, period, end of story. So this is where I'm coming from on this. George Washington, probably as many books are written about him as have been written about Abraham Lincoln. That's about 20,000 books. I got involved with George, like you are. You're in New Jersey. We live in American history. Summit, Beacon Hill, the Watchung Mountains, you could see the British were on the other side. Right now, I'm about 5 miles away from Washington's headquarters. The street below me, 202, troops march back and forth. 202 goes through Morristown, goes through Valley Forge, Brandywine, and going further north, it goes through West Point and goes through two capitals, Concord, New Hampshire, and also Augusta, Maine. So I always grew up around George Washington, and when I went to school, we had pictures of George Washington on the wall. Everybody had that. Unfortunately, that's not to happen. What had happened really got me even more involved. About 10 or 12 years ago, one of our members, his name is John T. Cunningham. John is one of the most outstanding New Jersey historians. Every library, not some, never say never and ever. Okay, every library has at least 2 or 3 of John Cunningham's books. And I'm in charge of programming and people, and John had written the book of Washington at Morristown. 175 people showed up at that meeting. We meet at the Frelinghuysen Arboretum. We were at Fire Code. And I said to John and 2 other members, you know, we ought to start an American Revolution Roundtable. And we did. And it blasted off. And we met at Washington's headquarters. But now I'm president, and I've been for quite a while, of the North Jersey Civil War Roundtable. What had happened on my lecture, and I started to lecture about George Washington. And the more I got into it, the more I learned, and it went on and on. And finally, what happened is I gave a 5-week course at Holyrood. That's the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute at Rutgers University. And Nolan Ash did the presentation on Alexander Hamilton. I thought about doing another one, but somehow I didn't think I can get it down to 10 lectures. This is George Washington. So the lecture you're going to hear today is not everything, because I'd be reading a laundry list, although I'll give you a part of a laundry list at the end of what Washington accomplished. However, I'm picking out what I think are the important parts. And by the way, for those of you who haven't attended any of my talks, I don't give a linear talk. What has happened, I see people, when you have a crowd in front of you, you see people look a little puzzled. So what I'll do, I'll say footnote, and at that point, I'll stop and I'll try to answer what I realize over the period of time have been questions, and I'll stop it. So it's not a linear talk. Washington doesn't die at the end of the talk. It's going to be 1792. I'm going to pick out the most important parts. The lecture is called The Precedents of the Preșident with an F. That's not a misspelling. That's the way they did it in 1789. And if you look at the original Constitution, you'll see it's double F and an S or whatever. I somehow got away from the precedents, particularly because I found some interesting stories. But if I wrote George Washington and the creation of the American cabinet, that would be a boring title. When I put down the precedents of the Preșident with the misspelling, the newspaper actually called me up and said, you have a misspelling? I said, you read it? And they said, yeah. Okay. So that's the key title to this and what it's about. The other thing is, most of you guys have been in business. George Washington is starting a country. How do you start a country? Okay. One of the things, you go into any business has been in existence. They give you a manual. They show you around. Everything's in existence. And you just take over into the slot where you are. The President of the United States at present time gets a big, thick book, about 700 or 800 pages of the president. But he walks into an office that's been in existence. Everybody's gone to work, and the old people haven't working. And really, some of the heads of the cabinet that exist are going to be pointed, but nothing stops. Traffic doesn't stop. Everybody goes to work. This is what happened. And I tried to do this by reading off a list. And let me tell you something. If you were in front of me, I'd watch you yawn. Okay? So I stopped that. So what I said, let me create my own scene of George's first day with a cabinet. Now, for those of you who are the purists, there wasn't a cabinet meeting until November 26, 1791. However, I decided I'm going to have a fictitious story, and maybe if I tell you the story, you'll follow what he's going through. So actually, there wasn't a cabinet meeting for that period of time, but I did create one, and it's going to be the day after Washington is inaugurated of April 30th, 1789. 1789, April 30th. Okay, that's a little late, but that's what's going to happen. So here's basically the story. And Martha Washington did not accompany him when he was for the inauguration. She stayed home. It took him 2 weeks to get, when he learned of the news of the election. So it wasn't like CNN. Somebody actually left New York, took him 2 weeks to go to Washington, to go to Mount Vernon and say, you've been elected president. And Washington, supposedly surprised, takes out a speech and starts to read it. And I often thought about that as this point is Marshall Washington, because there's no CNN, nobody knows, there's not an election going on, he's not campaigning, $0 spent on campaigning. I often felt that Martha Washington turned and says, so when are you going to tell me you're president of the United States? My wife would have done that. Okay. Suffice to say, Washington does come to New York, and it takes also several weeks because he's treated as a hero. And the way he gets into New York, coming across New Jersey, he goes through Trenton, then he goes through Elizabeth, and from there, it's called a barge, but it's like a long boat, which is rowed, and they row him in from Port Elizabeth, Elizabeth, into New York Harbor, and that's when it happens. Okay, so my scene now starts the day after May 1st. Again, it's a fictitious date. And George and Martha are in the house. Oh, by the way, the house where George, the first mansion, is on Water Street. And unfortunately, it is below one of the approaches to the Brooklyn Bridge. The house no longer exists. So I start off that morning, and Martha sees George getting dressed. She says, where are you going? He says, I'm going to my first cabinet meeting. She says, George, we're in New York. You didn't show me where your office is. Where was your office? He says, downstairs. She says, downstairs? Where? In the dining room. Why the dining room? It has a table. Stop. Footnote. Where does the president have? He has his office in his house. He doesn't commute. Now they have the West Wing, but he has his office in his house. George goes down to the meeting. And in the meeting, I've created the meeting of only 3 people. One is Alexander Knox, who's head of the Secretary of War, who will be appointed later. The other is Randolph, who was the Attorney General. And for this lecture, I brought in Madison. There are 3 people. Alexander Hamilton won't be appointed until about 6 months later, and Jefferson doesn't come in for 8 or 9 months later. So just as you start a meeting, he starts his meeting. These gentlemen, we don't have minutes, so there's no sense of doing it. I want to hold off on doing a treasurer's report. We know the numbers, but I would like to get into it. Congress has been in session for several weeks now. I know there are laws that have to be passed. Now, the Constitution does provide that I have to approve these within 10 days. So obviously it's later, and I'm sure they're going to give me some give, if I, to sign these. They're not automatically going to be enacted without my signature. So let's get started. Attorney General Randolph, can you tell me what laws have been passed that we should consider? I know this is going to take some time, but we have to do this, and I'd like to do this first before to go to any other business. And Randolph says, we don't have any laws. He says, what are you talking about? We have the Senate and the House of Representatives. What has the House of Representatives been doing? He says, well, right now they're working about fishing rights in Halifax, how to lay out the nets. Wait a minute, we got a whole country to work and they're doing nets? What about the Senate? They're figuring out what to call you. For 2 weeks, they have been figuring out what to name the president. And what has happened at this point is every time somebody says something, John Adams, who is vice president, answers. He says, you can't call him Mr. President. That's somebody you name head of a fire department. And he comes up with a convoluted name, His Majesty, I have it right here, His Royal Excellency, President of the United States and Protector of the Realm. He says, no. For 2 weeks, that's what they're doing. So when anybody speaks, Adams follows. And these guys don't just answer, they talk for 2 or 3 hours. And believe it or not, it goes on for 1 more week after that. 3 weeks, they're discussing what to call him. And nothing happens. And eventually it happens. And finally, the House of Representatives says, we're not going to call him that. It's Mr. President. He's not like that. I want to be called Mr. President. Again, he's coming down to our level. This is what George Washington's doing. He's not coming in as a realm, Your Majesty, or anything of that nature. He's coming in at this. They go on to the next part. General Knox, could you tell us about the Army? What is the status? We have 800 soldiers. Wait a minute. We have 800 soldiers from the Canada border to Florida. Is yes. And to the Appalachians, 800 soldiers, yes. That's it? What are we averaging, 1 soldier a mile? He says, that's about it. He says, we got to get more soldiers. He says, no, we can't do it. Madison says, no, we're against standing armies. We do not want standing armies. Therefore, we're going to rely on the militia. Now, Washington, of course, realized we're going to have to rely on this. 800 soldiers. Next, okay, now we're going to go into the budget. He says, we got to start hiring people. We have nothing. Where are we? He says, by the way, did they give me a manual how to start business? And they said, anything, what I'm doing here. And with that, Randolph shows them this. Okay. He says, what's that? He says, this is your manual. Or I could do it better like this. That's it, the sheet of paper. And he goes through it and he looks at it and he says, wait a minute. This is the Constitution. My name's on here. I was part of it when we were writing this thing. That's it? 2 pages? That's my manual? Yeah, that's it. Go start a country. Oh boy, we have to start hiring people. We have to, now the treasurer they have, we don't have any money in the treasurer. What do you mean we don't have treasurer? Well, okay, so we'll borrow. He says, we can't borrow. What do you mean we can't borrow? Well, the continental government owes over $2 million, $500,000 in interest. Yeah, but they're not going to loan us that. Why not? Because we owe more. What do you mean we owe more? Because the states owe $77 million. He says, wait a minute, I haven't opened the door yet. We owe $80 million. We got an army of 800 people. I'm going to start a country. Martha, get your bags. We're getting out of here. Okay, let's go back to where we are. So this is how the country is starting, and that's my story right now. This is where you're starting ground zero. Okay, let me now go into the inauguration itself, and I'll start from the beginning. If you'll notice that John Adams, this is one of the presidents, John Adams was not present there. He never becomes part of the cabinet. What happened to John Adams? Washington doesn't want him as an advisor. John Adams is educated. George Washington is not. And he feels that he is above him, that he's just treated as somebody ignorant by Adams. So what he does is Adams is not invited into the cabinet at all, because Washington doesn't want him. Now, that's first part of the precedent of a president. What happens to the vice president? The vice president, until Walter Mondale comes into position, is a non-entity. John Nance Garner says being president is worth a bowl of spit, warm spit, or whatever he said. But the point is, the vice president never takes a part in anything until Mondale comes into position. That's Senate. At this point, they've heard enough of John Adams, and they said, no. Your job is not to speak. In case of a tie, your job is to vote. And at that point, John Adams is shut out. He has no function as a vice president. He has no function whatsoever unless they come to a tied vote in the Senate. And basically, the vice president disappears from the history of the United States, unless somebody's killed. Then they come into or dies in office. Then the vice president comes in. And matter of fact, when Tyler comes in, they don't even believe him. They call him Your Excellency. That's the vice president. Let me go back. Now let's go back to the inauguration itself. Oh, by the way, one of the things I do is I can't see it, but I usually ask you guys questions when I have an audience. And at that point, people look up at the ceiling because they don't know a lot about this good stuff. On the day of inauguration, Washington arrives with several of the representatives and senators by horseback to the federal building, which is the city hall, which has now been converted into this. And what he is going to do is he is going to give the inauguration out in the open. And I'll explain this. One of the things that Washington is wearing is he tells Knox, I want you to get me a suit that's made in the United States. At this point, they rely on England for their clothing, the factories, etc. So he says to him, I want you to go to Hartford, make me a suit. Okay, a brown suit. Why brown? Why is that color important, and why am I even raising the question? When Washington will stand in front of a crowd, during the period they had the coercive acts, the various acts of Britain, and the United States or the colonies was boycotting Britain. They wore homespun, and the color of homespun was brown. Washington says, he has knee breeches and buckles, and a sword. He looks, but that's the color of brown. This is what he's looking for. Now, for the first time, and this is the United States now, Washington is going to be inaugurated in front of a crowd. There's going to be in the balcony here. Why? If you remember, in England, whenever they have something, everything, especially the coronations, that's in a closed building. It's only the invited people. Everybody is going to be invited to hear Washington speak. And that's what he does. And this is an interesting, because I gave this from a Masonic temple, and they realized they wanted a Bible. And nobody thought about it. So they go to a Masonic temple, which is nearby, and they bring him, although he's a Mason, he gets sworn in on the Bible. That's not a precedent, however. Other people are not being sworn in. And with that, and I'm going to read this, he then takes Chancellor of New York, Livingston, gives him the oath. And again, now we see the Chief Justice giving an oath, but over the period of time, that didn't happen. Obviously, when Coolidge gets sworn in, his father swears him in because it's a death through there, and obviously Lyndon Johnson gets sworn in on an airplane through that. But this is the oath that he's going to take, and it's written in the Constitution. He says, before he entered on the execution of his office, he shall take the following oath or affirmation. Footnote, you notice what it says affirmation. We always say we solemnly swear, but it's affirmed. And there was one president, and that's not on the test, who was affirmed. I do solemnly swear or affirm that I will faithfully execute the office of the President of the United States and will, to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. What's missing? So help me God. When recently, when you watched the recent inauguration, you heard that they always say, that now it's the Chief Justice says, so help me God. They didn't, it is believed that Washington said this. Somebody's mentioned like 30, 40 years ago, but from then on, they do all add, so help me God. Now, the oath is really important, word by word. On Obama too, Roberts missed one word or two words. The following day, they go to the White House and he gives and he renders the oath the second time. That's how important that oath is. And so it comes strictly in the, it comes strictly within the Constitution. Now, I mentioned that Washington, when he's giving this speech, oh, by the way, the crowd is so big that he actually has to walk home. He can't get through the crowd. When he goes through, when he goes out to the balcony, he walks through the Senate. Okay, no one knows the answer to this because I've done this over and over again. Okay, I used to ask this question. Okay, you remember the 13 original colonies? And then I used to ask people, how many US senators from each state? You really don't want to know the answers that we're getting in the library. At this point, you get, what do you people take at school? Okay, there are two senators. And God forbid I ask them who's the New Jersey senators now. Oh boy, they look at the windows up in the ceiling. You don't want to know the answers. Okay, suffice to say, so now there's 13 original colonies. He's walking through the Senate. How many senators are present? 13. Okay, look, come on, technician. No one put your hand down. Okay, 13 times 2 is 26. No, 22. Why? Because North Carolina and Rhode Island have not signed the Constitution, not part of it. So there's only 11 states now. Next, now this is, you won't see on Jeopardy or Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, okay? Okay, there were 69 electoral votes. So how many states voted for Washington? Okay, we already eliminated, come on. 22, wrong. New York never sent electors. So there were 10 states that voted for him. Okay, I told you I wasn't going to bring it up to date, but recently we had a problem with who were going to be electors that were going to vote on this past election. Okay, so there were 10 states. On the second election, there are now 2 more states that have joined the union, and that's Vermont and Kentucky. Okay, so he's the only president that he is nominated unanimously. Now, I am going to go out of sequence. This is something because I know. Oh, by the way, I should have pointed out, I don't know if it shows you, that's my PowerPoint presentation. Okay, that's it. Didn't need a screen for it, but that was it. I always watch PowerPoint. You sit there, some of these guys work PowerPoint. You want to go for it? No, they want to go back. No. You want to go for it? No. And then they show us a picture of Abraham Lincoln. Oh, come on, I didn't know he looked like that. He had a beard. Okay, next. One of the things that I am putting in here, okay. I'm going to go in and out of sequence of what happens here. Washington is given the power to name people to office. And one of the things he does is he points a Benjamin Fishburne in the point of naval officer to the port of Savannah. Now they're in a hurry. They want to get everything through. They're passing it. When it comes to this guy, he's not approved. The guy was a hero. Washington immediately goes to the Senate and says, what happened? I appointed him. Why didn't you name him? Finally, some guy from the South, one of the Cavaliers, gun stands up. I didn't want him. What do you mean you don't want him? I don't want him. I don't have to give you any reasons. And with that, the other senator from Georgia says, yeah, we don't want him. That's the start of senatorial courtesy. We have it in New Jersey. We have it all over. Any senator can block the appointment of any individual. Washington realizes it. He says, well, they're not going to tell me who to pick. And by the same token, I'm not going to tell them. So therefore, it's a wash. And that's the start of senatorial courtesy. It's not written anywhere in the Constitution. It's nowhere written. It's just they're honoring it. And unfortunately, it caused a lot of problem because, you know, literally some senator is holding everything up. Okay. Next one I want to point out here is, okay, Nolan Ash is sitting here. I know. Wait, when are you going to mention Alexander Hamilton? When are you going to mention him? Okay, I am going out of sequence, and I'm going to do something for Alexander Hamilton, and it's strictly because Nolan is here. And very frankly, when I usually give this talk, it's not a big part of my talk. I may mention it at the end. Okay. He's the only one that knows this. On August 7th, Nolan Ash will celebrate a day, which if you guys are lucky, maybe you'll get a talk. And you know what that day is? National Lighthouse Day. Okay? Okay, why is that important? One of the things, it's the first act of Congress and the ninth act of Congress and the first public works that provided the transfer of existing lighthouses to the United States. And why is this important? The way they're doing this is because Alexander Hamilton says this is going to improve trade. How does it improve trade? If you have a lighthouse, ships don't go into a reef and sink. And for early part of American history, a lot of places, they turned off the lighthouse. Why? Because of the stormy night, and then the scavengers would come in deliberately and scavenge the ships. Alexander Hamilton can't say, it's never come into consideration that this is going to be a safety measure, but it's going to be in the implement of trade. And they start taking over the lighthouses. Initially, it's a little reluctant because some of the states are charging port fees based upon the lighthouses. But Alexander Hamilton says this is something we have to do. And he takes it over, and then he's going to start the Coast Guard. What is important about this is the lighthouses are now being built by the United States. So the states are now saving the money. They're relinquishing only a small part of the property for this, but the lighthouses are going to be built, and it will be, and it's under the Department of Treasury, and they are going to appoint the people through the Treasury for the lighthouses. And the first lighthouse, in case you weren't, it was built in Cape Henry, Virginia, at the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay. New Jersey, just a little sideline, 3 of our lighthouses were designed by General Meade of Gettysburg, and that's the ABCs of Beacon, Barnegat, and Cape May. So these are all federal. Now they're being quite eliminated to a large extent by ships and what have you. But the point is, this is started under Alexander Hamilton through that. Okay, I got him out of the way. Oh, by the way, I came across something when I'm doing a little bit of research on this. I once had a question years ago from this group actually, and says, was George Washington a micromanager? And I had to say, yeah. And now I found something here, is they would approve all the expenses for whatever they had for the lighthouse. And one of the things they had is they approve a chain for the Delaware Bay. And George Washington writes, the entire loss of the chain so bad you can't use part of it. It's $150. Okay, so he read this, but he approved it. So they got the chain for the Delaware Bay. Okay, let's go on to some next stuff. I don't know what, by the way, what time did I start? 11 o'clock, 10:30? You guys will raise your hand. Okay, next, very important, advise and consent. This is specifically in the Constitution, Article 2, Section 2. He shall have the power and with the advice and consent of the Senate to make treaties. the first time George Washington has a treaty, and it's going to be with the Indians. And following this, he goes to the Senate and he says, I want the approval of this treaty, which I am working with the Indians. And somebody said, would you read that? So it's read. And then somebody says, you know, the building they're in has a lot of traffic on it. Wagons, horses, animals, people outside. Close the windows. It's a summer day. So they read it. And they're still having a problem hearing it. And William McLay of Pennsylvania says, wait a minute, I don't have to approve this. I want to know what this is all about. I want to discuss it. Washington is furious. He's listened to it twice. I think they actually read it 3 times. Now they want to discuss it, and he's furious. He says, I'm never coming back here again. 3 days later, he does come back. And now they very politely approve it. He never returns to the Senate. He doesn't ask him for advice. So the advise, ADVISE, is no longer asked. He does submit the treaties, but they have to pass it by a 2/3 vote. So that ends advise and consent through this, which is really interesting because that's a very important part of the Constitution, advice and consent, and just for that period of time. By the way, George Washington is able to get away with a lot of stuff. They write a Constitution that composes only 2 pages. Why? Because it's George Washington. They know he's going to do the right thing. This is a man purely of honor. So where everything goes into detail about everything else, not with George Washington. And they sort of kick it down the can that they won't have a problem with it. But that's George Washington. That's like really 2 pages of what they're telling him to do. Here's another part that I think is extremely important. One of the things that Washington, I'm not going to develop it, I don't think I have enough time. But one of the things that Washington does is to show that this is a country. We're no longer colonies. We're no longer separate colonies. We are going to be a country. And he's going to tour every state in the United States, which he does. Well, the last one to go to is in Rhode Island. Rhode Island is the last state to ratify this. When he goes to Rhode Island, this to me is that important. He goes to Rhode Island, and it's now the Truro Synagogue. What has happened? These are Sephardic Jews, wherever they came from Holland, they came out of South America. These are not the Ashkenazi from Northern, but they're always concerned wherever they are located, they are going to have to practice their religion in accordance with whether they're allowed by the government, and if they're allowed, under what terms and where and how. What they're doing now is Washington is coming in. They're going to plead their case with him. They're not going to say that we're an extraneous group of savages or whatever. We have the same links in our religion. So they're writing him a letter, and listen to it, it's like almost like lawyers presenting their case. He says, to the President of the United States, to permit the children of the stock of Abraham to approach you. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, again, basic from the Old Testimony. To esteem you for your person and to join our fellow citizens and welcome you. With pleasure, we reflect on those days of difficulty and danger, where the God of Israel, who delivered David, again, reference to the Bible, from the peril of the sword, shielded your head. Here's a comparison. Shielded your head in the day of battle. But we rejoice to think that the same Spirit who rested in the bosom of our greatly beloved Daniel, enabling him to preside over the provinces, and ever rest upon you, enabling you to discharge over the duties of the chief magistrate of these states. They're comparing him to going back to the Bible. Okay, here's the line. He says, deprived as we heretofore have been of the invaluable rights of free citizens, we now, with a deep sense of gratitude to the almighty disposer of events, behold a government erected by the majesty of the people, a government to which bigotry gives no sanction, the persecution no assistance, but generously affording all liberty of conscience and immunities. And it goes on, they go on to say, and when like Joshua of days of old and full of honor are gathered to your forefathers, you will go, you will go too. That's what they're asking him for. We want to be able to do this. We have your assurance. Please, we're on your side through this. And by the way, one of the reasons they're going, this congregation is in Rhode Island. This is where Roger Williams goes. He's thrown out of Massachusetts with Ann Hutchinson, which they really can't practice. And what does Washington answer him? Okay. Washington goes one step better. This is why I'm really this is just amazing. He's okay. Well, I'm cutting out a lot. I'm really here. You guys like me, etc. But thank you very much for your kind words. Okay. The citizens of the United States of America have a right to applaud themselves for having given to mankind example of an enlarged and liberal policy, a policy worthy of invitation. All possess alike of liberty of conscience and immunities of citizenship. Okay, here's the kicker. It is now more than toleration is spoken of as if it were the indulgence of one class of people that another enjoy the exercise of their inherent natural rights. For happily the government of the United States, which gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance, requires only that they who are under its protection comport themselves as good citizens. And may the children of the stock of Abraham who land in this land continue to enjoy the goodwill of everybody. What's he saying here? You can almost read the annoyance. He says, I can't give it to you. This is part of this country. This is a given. You don't have to ask anybody for this at all. Think about other countries. And what he's also saying to them, you were part of this country. The analogy is if you go to France, you'll never be a Frenchman or Spain, a Spaniard. But if you come to the United States, you're an American, period. Think about that. The naturalization. People are American, period. Again, I'll never be a Spaniard or a Frenchman. Same thing. And this is what Washington's saying. You don't ask, you got it. To me, that's a marvelous statement of where they're coming from. Don't forget, when the country was started, the Anglican Church, that's in England. And even under Patrick Henry, they want support of the churches. That was a big fight with Patrick Henry. He wants the churches to continue to be supported through that. And this is where Washington is coming from. Next, the Whiskey Rebellion. Everybody laughs at the Whiskey Rebellion. So that sounds funny. Okay. Where they're getting their money from is from duties or tariffs that are paid in port. Hamilton realizes, and I haven't gone into the assumption, guys. I told you this is going to be, I can go on for hours on this one. I told you it was a 5-week course. And this is where no one really kicked in, really, to get just this one lecture for an hour and a half. You're getting 3 minutes worth of this. So what is the Whiskey Rebellion and why is it so terrible? Hamilton says we are going to charge for the whiskey, the factories, everything with the whiskey, and they're going to pay for it. This is direct tax. The import tax is just paid by everybody. It comes in, it's paid once, and whoever whoever the wholesaler is, charges, just keeps adding. So nobody actually sees the tax on the tax. These guys will see it, and they want it now. What happens in Western Pennsylvania, early Kentucky, is there are riots. So the collectors come in to collect the money. And horribly, what they do to these guys is they tar and feather them. That's a horrible thing when you laugh tar and feather. That's hot tar that's poured over somebody. He's beaten up. They're putting feathers on and they're rolled through town and then just thrown off to the side of the road. They do this a lot. And they do it with one of Washington's chief collectors whose property is burned down. They then have several thousand people from Pennsylvania who gather on Braddock Field. And their thing is, many of them are soldiers that have fought in the American Revolution. And they're saying taxation without representation. We did not vote for this. That's where they're at. They're not going to pay it. And the representative from Pennsylvania says, I didn't vote for it. Washington has a problem now. He remembers Shays' Rebellion, where there was a revolt against paying taxes. How do we get them to do it? Pennsylvania under Mifflin, who has always caused him a problem, even when he was a general, a quartermaster, later on, says, well, we could work this out. This is a state responsibility. It's not the responsibility of the federal government. And Washington initially says, go ahead and do it. So they do send out peace representatives who come back because they're going nowhere. At this time, Washington, for the first time, a president of the United States will put on his uniform, raise an army, and go to fight these people. And what they do is 12,000. They come in from Pennsylvania, New York, and Delaware, and New Jersey, and they meet in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, and they are going to put down this rebellion. This isn't. If this starts, the people have a right to choose what taxes they're going to pay. The country is going to be destroyed. He makes it as far as Carlisle, and at that point, he puts Hamilton in charge. They do round up some of the, and when they see the army coming, everybody disperses at this point. And what Hamilton does, he does punish a few of them, but nobody is hanged for this. And the whiskey tax starts. Today's question: because of the whiskey tax, what is the start of what sport? Not the start; it starts later. What sport comes out of the Whiskey Rebellion? NASCAR racing. Remember the revenuers are running away? That's the whiskey tax. So Alexander Hamilton started NASCAR racing. I bet you Rand Chalet didn't know that. Okay, but in any event, this has now, again, it's unified the United States. And I think I'll just do just one more briefly, and this becomes, and I have to do it because no one will really go out of mind on this one. Okay, the National Bank. There's nothing in the Constitution for a national bank. Washington follows the law. He's done this while he's a general. The soldiers aren't paid and they want to get paid. Washington says no. Congress stands. He will listen to the law. He's not going to take it upon himself. He can't find anything. So he goes to Randolph and he says to Jefferson, he says, can we have a national bank? By the way, at this point, there is no unified trade. They are using 38 different types of currencies. And in addition, they're using notes. So if I need to go, let's say, I'll use an example. I have to borrow money to go because I'm going into, I don't know, Virginia. And I said, Nolan, I need a note. Will you give me a note? So Nolan loans me the money. And I take this note and I want to spend something in Virginia. They don't know him. So what's that note worth? And this is what happens. This money is basically discounted and discounted and discounted until when eventually, this is no way to run a country. Hamilton says we need a bank. Well, it's not in the Constitution. So Jefferson and Madison come forth and they say, here it is, Amendment 10. Okay, December 15th, the 10 amendments are ratified. And it says the power is not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited to it by the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. Washington doesn't know what to do. He needs the bank. Hamilton's telling him he needs the bank. So what happens? He says, Hamilton, give me something. And in several days, Hamilton puts out a treatise. And he goes back into the Constitution and he goes to Article 1, Section 8, the last and 18th paragraph, to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers, and all other powers vested by the Constitution in the government of the United States or any department or order thereof. That's the start of the bank. This is Hamilton. That's what he gets this through, and that's the important part. Okay, I guess I'm running tight, but I'm going to eliminate a few of the things I did. You guys have enough. Basically, okay, here's the laundry list, and I know what I've missed out, and no one will tell me, okay? And that's the assumption of the debt, and that, oh heck, no one's smiling, I got to do it. one of the big things, how do they get Washington, D.C., and how do they take care of the debt? Again, that's Hamilton. We get rid of the debt, we could borrow money. Well, the South isn't going to agree to it. On the other hand, they want the capital in the South. Where's the capital of the United States going to be? Right now, it's meeting in New York. So the agreement has worked. And if you read Founding Brothers or one of the books, one of the things, the big thing is supposed to be a dinner that Jefferson says, I met Hamilton on the street. He was looking haggard and gaunt. He was really looking terrible. And I asked him, what's the matter? He said, I can't get the debt being taken care of. Congress, you've got to work something out. It was a good story. Jefferson makes this up himself, but that's another story. So what happens is the reality was several days before that, Washington takes Hamilton and Madison on a 3-day fishing boat off New Jersey. That's where the discussion really takes place. You don't read about that, but Jefferson does. So the agreement is that the United States will absorb the debt of the states. I'm really cutting this short. Absorb the debt of the states, and the deal was that Washington, D.C. will be in Washington. Well, they actually named it Washington while Washington's alive. So I'm really cutting short on that. And that's when Nolan did a whole program of just on this facet alone. But that's what happens. And what happens as a result of this, one thing what happens, it says, you could buy debt. When the term of Washington is finished, the debt is paid off, and Holland is now asking the United States, you want to borrow money? So we're in a great financial position as a result of this. Okay, the laundry list. Here we go. So what happens during the legislation of Washington is the Judiciary Act of 1789. That's the Supreme Court. Washington elects everybody. The Naturalization Act of 1790. The Residence Act I just talked about, that's Washington, D.C. Copyright 1780. Bank Act, you heard 1791. The excise tax to whiskey. The Coinage Act, they're making coins now. Okay. The Militia Act is able to call up the militia when they have a problem. The Naval Act of 1794. We have peace at home. The inauguration of a Navy, bolstered by the Army. And there's another thing. The Army applied, believe it or not, the Constitution provide for the Navy, but they got to go, they have to get funding for the Army every 2 years. That's in the Constitution. They want a militia. They don't want a standing Army. And Washington has a hard time. We have a Coast Guard. He's been to every state. He established his law and order in suppressing rebellion, a budgetary and tax procedure, federal debts paid. He scrupulously adheres to the letter of the law. Okay, he resigns the presidency of the United States. This guy could have been kept in forever, although he had a hard time the second time. What this is saying, until Roosevelt breaks this, and then he actually changed the Constitution not to allow it again. But Washington resigns after the second term. He does it when he's a general. George III said, if he really did that, he's the greatest man ever. But he resigns as president of the United States, and he personifies the American Revolution. And he sets a standard. So when I have a really ask me, well, who do you, you're president of the Civil War Roundtable, who do you know, as far as I'm concerned, Washington is still number one. Okay, I'll take questions, but let me give I was told yesterday I can give a 2-minute plug for my group. Okay, North Jersey Civil War Roundtable. Right now we're meeting on Zoom. We are one of the largest. We had 2 Pulitzer Prize winners. We would have had a third if it wasn't for COVID. And if you want to get on the list, we have some good, our next program coming at the end of the month is The Day Dixie Died, the Battle of Atlanta. And then we're going with something called Medicinal Plants of the Civil War, which we had the director of the Arboretum said, Rich, a number of years ago, she said, you hear about the arms and the legs being cut off. What about the medicines? We attracted a unusually large crowd for this because, and we actually had people who never would have walked into our ground. Civil War, what are you guys I'm not a reenactor. I wore uniform once, no more. But that's going to have a big crowd. If you're interested, you can be on my list. It's if you don't remember, you can get Nolan. It's NJ Civil War RT@AOL.com.
It was great. And the first person with their hand up, by the way, everybody start raising your hands. Bill Tittle.
Okay, so Rich, I'm overwhelmed. I mean, I don't have a question because your style, your presentation style was so it bespoke knowledge. So, I just trust you. So thank you very much. And it's very amusing, it's very engaging. I mean, I think we're all entranced. I think if you ever get tired of this historical stuff, you can be the next Jay Leno. I'm telling you. So I think I did.
Wow, I appreciate it.
Oh yeah, the question was, can you repeat the name of your organization website? NJ.
You have a horror. Okay. Basically, I have a group of Luddites in charge of my group. So it's the horrible website. Don't even go there. North Civil War Roundtable, RT@AOL.com. It's the acronym NJ for North Jersey and RT at the end for Roundtable. By the way, if you don't know, if you belong to the Elks or Moose, you belong to a lodge. I belong to a post for my Jewish war veterans. But the same thing, a roundtable is, we don't have tables. We got crowds like you do now. And we don't sit around the table. But it's an appellation that's given to a history group, a roundtable.
Okay.
Okay,
Thank
so
you.
I will agree to include the link in the next blast email, and you can all just click on it and check it out. Rich would be delighted to have some of you guys drop in to one or more of their events, or even join their organization if you're a real history buff, and I know we have plenty. So, Peter Merritt.
And ask the question, but yeah, I mentioned that before.
It's the situation. Fascinating talk. Have you ever visited George Washington's ancestral home in the north of England, where they raise the American flag and play the national anthem every day? That's one.
No, I don't.
Huh.
No, I haven't.
And the other thing I thought was quite ironic was that when you sang the song about Washington, you were singing the British national anthem, which presumably he was pretty much against that.
Yeah, okay, cool. That's God bless America. No, it's not. Whatever.
Okay. So anyway, I've been there, and it's worth visiting in north of England.
I'm curious. Wait a minute. I got to ask you a question. You're on the other side. What do you think about the whole revolution? How did you learn about the revolution?
How do I learn about the revolution?
Are we the good guys or the bad guys?
I've read a fascinating book by Rutherford called New York, which really tells you how it really was at the time, in my opinion, how families were so divided, fathers against son and daughters and wives, and everybody was, it was almost a 50-50 debate whether they were loyalists or patriots. So in a way, I guess I'm in that camp since I've become an American citizen. I would say I'm with the patriots. But I suppose many years ago, I would have been with the loyalists, so I switched.
It's interesting. You got to read history. By the way, I didn't go into how the cabinet was developed or why the cabinet was developed, but I borrowed a book from the library. It's called The Cabinet, and I don't know if it's coming out. Okay, believe it or not, it's author's name is Lindsay Chervinsky. There are only 2 copies of the entire state, and they gave it to me from the Summit Library. I'll finish in about 2 weeks, but I'm the guy who has your copy.
Oh. So tell me.
By the way, what people do ask about certain books that are coming out is obviously the classic is Ron Chernow's George Washington, but there's another book coming out. It's called George Washington: The Political Rise of America's Founding Father by David O. Stewart. I'm reading that. It's really a fascinating book. I probably have a shelf of Washington books, but each time you do, you get something else out of it.
So, Rich, I've always been wondering, where did the word cabinet come from? Was that already in use in England, say? What did it mean?
Oh, no. Oh, okay. Okay, the cabinet. I know the reason I'm saying, believe it or not. Okay, I don't like giving long answers, but I got to give you the answers.
We got time.
Okay, but it'll take longer than you asked for. They did not want to use the word cabinet. Why? Because it was the Privy Council who was a cabinet who was making the decisions against the United States, or the colonies. They always felt that they would appeal to George III. It was a cabinet who was doing all these horrible things, passing the laws, passing everything else. And they keep saying, if we would speak to George III, he would realize what's happening to us. At the Battle of Concord and Lexington and Concord, the Minutemen, they leave the field. They're singing "God Bless the King." They're saying we're the King's men. They haven't gone over to the other side yet. So what happens is they're reluctant to use the word cabinet. When they come in, they're called advisors. But as the passage of time, and they realize at this point, they don't want to give Washington a cabinet because this is the cabinet and they're going to overwhelm it. And they don't like the name and who these people are terrible people. But it dawns on them, this guy needs help. He needs advisors. So they start to allow the advisors to take over. And then eventually the guys started calling themselves the cabinet. But George Washington controls it. The cabinet has no say whatsoever. They're not going to pass anything. They're not going to do anything. It's when he wants, how he wants it. And he's going to use it as for advice. And it goes into use. But at that point, the stench of what the Privy Council has done has long since gone. That's what it is.
So, Rich, I have a question. Having, there was George Washington with the help of his good buddies, Alexander Hamilton and a few others, and they were kind of inventing it. They were kind of on-the-job training. They were kind of inventing a government that wasn't like any other that had ever existed. And they had pretty good success. We're still following most of what they come up with. But I'm wondering, when all the dust settled in his life, what do you think was maybe his biggest disappointment about what he might have tried to do and didn't manage to pull off?
I think what happened is they did not believe in political parties. These were men of honor. And what happens is first term, he's doing okay. He wants to get out of it. And they say, and they come to him. And what happens is somebody like Madison goes over to the other side. I had a nice little quote. What happened to Madison? All of a sudden, Madison takes the part of Jefferson. And what Jefferson does is disgrace. They actually have a paper. They pay for a paper, which then writes against Washington. I totally lost a lot of respect for Jefferson through this. And what happens is the political parties are insulting him, are going after him, are attacking him. It's not getting what he wants done. They want to go back to whatever, no bank, no nothing. It's going to be an agricultural society. Yeah, it's terrific if you're a slave owner and you have slaves working your farm, but it's not working for the rest of the country. And I think that's where it happens. As a matter of fact, when Washington dies and Jefferson wants to pay a call, Martha Washington says, no, don't. I mean, that's where it's come from, through this. And the reason I told where Madison writes the Constitution, then writes against it, and what happens is Madison is from Virginia. He can't be elected senator because Patrick Henry, they don't want the Constitution. So what happens? He ends up in the House of Representatives. And then at that point, if you're in the politics and you want to stay in politics, you can go outside and scream, nothing happens. So he shifts over to the other side. And then he starts attacking. And these guys are doing really surreptitiously, especially through Jefferson. The more you read, Jefferson writes these great words. It's nice, but that becomes the.
Peter Merritt, you have another question.
Yes, I'm still not clear. How did a country or an administration that was really bankrupt, I suppose, pretty much, how did they in fact raise money? With what collateral? And exactly from whom? From where did they get the money to support the government?
In the beginning, what the money they're coming from is basically on imports coming in, tariff duties. They don't have a government really. There's there's nothing internal, nothing works. The states are taking care of it. There's a great big fight about internal improvements. It's not the responsibility of the government. Hamilton realizes
I'll
this is where the
pride of being
coming in.
the monthly host if I can.
Pardon?
I'll take pride of being the monthly host if I can, because being a Hamiltonian, I have a precise answer.
Go ahead.
The reason why the United States went from bankrupt to AAA rated is because of two things. First of all, Alexander Hamilton consolidated all the state debts into the federal debts. How do you pay back your debts? you have to have taxes. He put taxes on ships. He didn't want to tax people until we got to whiskey. He put taxes on ships. Now, smuggling was a great business, and Hamilton came from the Caribbean, so he knew all about smuggling. Hamilton created what we now call the United States fucking Coast Guard. He created it in 1790. The Coast Guard was, by his instruction, still is the smallest, most efficient part of the American military. He designed the ships. They were meant to be fast and heavily armed ships. They would grab all the ships before they got into port. The approach was you'd get rid of all the goods before you came into port. The Coast Guard would come up to the ship, put a gun to the captain's head and say, "You're paying your fucking taxes now." And continue. How do you get to borrow money? Hamilton rapidly paid back the debt with the money the Coast Guard was collecting. And then we had the whiskey tax, which of course was a little less popular. But by the time Washington left office, we had the equivalent, as Rich said, the Dutch, our credit was good with the Dutch, who were the cheapest guys in the world. Done.
Thank you, Nolan. So there are actually no more hands raised. You have one more chance, guys, but it is.
I asked two rhetorical questions I put in the chat, but I guess nobody picked up on it. But we'll play a little handball, Rich and I.
Answer the questions there, because I'm not opening the chat. I can't.
That's okay. That's okay. I get to ask my two rhetorical questions anyway. Who is the only president who was ever elected by the Electoral College unanimously twice? Not once, but twice, and would have been unanimously elected a third time. We know who that is. Okay.
Washington.
Yeah, good one. And why did Alexander Hamilton insist when they were building the lighthouses, which you're right, were for economic reasons, is why did he insist that there be a project and money, federal money, put into every single state to tie the states together, which they were loosely put together? Another way Hamilton tried, well, he assumed all their debts, which was nice, which tied them together, and he gave big construction jobs to every single state to help build the lighthouses, which also bound states together. My pal Al.
Thank you. We actually have one more question from Larry Cunningham.
Rich, that was really a good presentation.
Thank you.
Actually, I don't really necessarily have a question similar to Bill Tittle, but you know, when I think back to high school and college days and the history classes that I took, 0.1% of what you presented ever gets put across to most people. So, you know, I'm thinking, you know, our current representatives and current senators would probably be well plus to learn a little bit of a history lesson, because I would bet there's a large percentage that know very little of what you just presented over the last 45 minutes. So I just wish there was a way somehow that you guys could influence the Board of Education across New Jersey and across other states and make sure that whatever history is being presented, that it at least captures, if not all of it, at least the important kernels that you've put forward.
But I'm going to show my answer to this. One of the things that it's the competition in New Jersey it's a statewide United States competition. It's called History Day. Students from all over New Jersey, there's 2,500 students that will compete. Every year they get a topic. One year it's turning points in history, the person in the moment, defining moments, etc. But in New Jersey, over 2,500 students will participate in this competition. The students are junior, senior, individual group. They could do a paper, a documentary. They will do a performance or a website, and the first things are the exhibits. The finals are held. There are three semifinals. There are three regionals. One's in South Jersey. They alternate between Princeton and for the semis in Princeton and Rutgers. And the third is either probably in Kane or Seton Hall. The finals, 1,000 people were gathered in the auditorium, and with that, we give out prizes. So for the Civil War, but the winners then go on to the University of Maryland. These students, you do not believe, and if you want to attend on our May meeting, I'm going to have a documentary of a young girl in the 9th grade. And it's something you watch on television with music, with, I mean, it's just phenomenal. You would watch it on television. So if you want to come to our May meeting, I'm starting a little earlier, and we're going to show this young girl her documentary. And you'll see what kids are doing. So there's a group of kids that are really getting history heavy duty. On the other hand, and I really want to tell because I'm related to this young man, no, young woman, I said to her, what are you learning about? And this is Randolph Nobles. What are you learning? She says, we're learning about the China one-child policy. I said, how about Alexander Hamilton? And I really don't want to, she was a one-word answer. You really don't want to know who. Okay, so
Hey, Rich.
yeah.
Send the link to me. I'll forward it to our guys. You've piqued our curiosity. Now here's the last question of the day, Miguel.
Yes, thank you very much. My question might be a little bit forward-looking from the scope of the topic, but basically they didn't want a standing army. They wanted to rely on the militias. Do you have an opinion on how the National Guard Act of 1903 that created the National Guards in every state affected what was previously called militias? Some people think, I think Warren Burger, Supreme Court said that basically there were no more legal militias, and other people have a different opinion. Do you have an opinion on, or any kind of interpretation of that? Because I think the National Guard is the standing militia.
I was in the Air National Guard. They didn't have that in Washington State, but I'm really not going to give an opinion on that. What happened? The states want to control their own. They want to have it. It's their political appointments. They have it. The only good part about it is when there's an emergency, the president could I can't think of the word. Mobilize the National Guard to handle. But every state wants to handle because they want to handle certain things like an emergency. Like New Jersey, for example, you have the flood, right? You have the floods, or you have Operation Sandy. The guards called in, or the National Guard right here was called in Rockaway to give shots. So that's the purpose of it, where you really can't have. So
no, I agree. I'm sorry. I maybe I didn't phrase it clearly. I agree that there's a National Guard and a need for it in each state. My question is, did it replace the informal militias, standing militias that they had in the colonies? And that's what, that was Warren Burger's opinion in the Supreme Court some years ago. But other people don't seem to share that opinion.
No, I really haven't given them much thought, what the change was. Like somebody think, I'm going to leave it go with that.
So it's actually 11:39 now. It's just about time to call it quits, but we actually do have one more hand. Ron Hoke, if you can ask a quick question.
Okay, I
Yes.
finally made it. Could you give us a short list on the people who had the most influence on George Washington? Who were his most influential advisors?
You kidding? You think I'm going to answer this with Nolan Ash here? Come on.
Yeah, we know that. We know number one.
Number one, in Washington's own words, my most trusted and important advisor in all things.
We know that.
I guess that ends that discussion.
So how about, was there a number two? Go ahead.
Number two, there were others. I mean, Rich could say just as
I
well.
would-
Let's
I
hear
would-
Richard's answer.
No, in the beginning, I think it was Madison, because Madison comes,
Yes.
he's the one who helps him, the importance of the Constitution, why we need it, et cetera, et cetera. Madison lives at the House. And for the first term, for the most part, for the first term, he is relying on Madison for advice. He's worked with him over the period of time. So I would give it. The second term, absolutely not. Then they're turning against him altogether, through that. He's using Knox really for the army. Knox, but how to do that, and with the exception of the Whiskey Rebellion, Knox knows what to do. Edmund Randolph, for the first 6 years, he's relying on him for legal advice. He was his personal attorney till they have a they'll be basically almost, well, it's a whole big conflict of why he resigns. But for the first years, Edmund Randolph is also there. The other people, I don't know. No, I can't think of anybody else really that would really. John Jay, to a certain extent, is
Yes.
giving advice.
Yes, yes, yes.
You know,
Thank you very much. I knew who was going to be number one, but I was interested in the other positions.
Yeah.
Thank
Thank you.
the others are
So-
3 and 4. There's no number 2, right? No.
Well, you're very right that Madison was important in the first term.
Right.
And when he was thinking about not running for reelection, both Jefferson and Hamilton begged Washington to run for reelection because the country would fall apart. And he did reluctantly run. But during the Jay Treaty debate in 1795, Madison was lying. And this is what finished Madison with George Washington. He was lying because the Senate approved the Jay Treaty, but the House was fighting. And Madison was saying, well, the House has to approve treaties. And of course, that's absolutely wrong. And George Washington brings up his notes on the Constitutional Convention, his notes, and shows how Madison was lying. He never spoke to James Madison again, ever. That's how important integrity was to George Washington. And he had a bond with Hamilton that goes back to the Revolutionary War, which can never be duplicated by someone who did not fight in the war, Jefferson or Adams or Madison. There was a blood bond, if you will, that also was underlying the relationship.
Oh, by the way, what I have.
Thank you,
what I-
Nolan. Nolan, thank you. You know, I think it's time to
time.
wind it down.
Yeah,
And,
I think it's time. I
And
hate
by
to
the way,
restrict
Nolan, you're
things.
the guy. Are you ready to do
I
the
hate
honors?
to restrict things.
Closing ceremony, Rich. There we go.
Okay, Rich, this is not your first rodeo, not radio, but as you know, we give out a certificate of appreciation, which is beautiful and has a orchid on it. We were the orchid capital of the East Coast, as I understand it, when this club was formed in 1930, and you'll get a hard copy in due course. And I think I join everybody else in thanking you for an outstanding talk and giving you a round of applause.
Thank you. I really appreciate that.
But
Thank you.